Hi, everybody. Welcome to the screencast of PFC's Landscape Report. We're really pleased you're here and also very pleased that we're able to produce this for you. The Landscape Report came out in 2024, and we've been providing members with presentations on the key findings. In this screencast, we welcome you into the conversation if you were unable to join any of the previous presentations. My name is Michele Fugiel Gartner. I'm the lead researcher at PFC. And just as a scene setting, I want to say that this screencast is an opportunity to acknowledge the ancestors, the cultures of giving that have been created in Canada, that have come before us, as well as the medley of community and cultures and peoples that currently reside in Canada. And so today is an opportunity for learning and inquiry. So whether you are listening to this on your own or in a group, we welcome you into this research conversation. I've been working in philanthropy since 2006. I worked at Social Venture Partners in Calgary and Trico Foundation as my first roles in Canada, and then relocated to the UK where I did my PhD research. So as part of this Landscape Report research, I came back into Canada, and I share that to say my positionality was one of understanding Canadian philanthropy, but after 9 years coming back in with fresh eyes. And so this report reflects that position. I welcome you to follow along using the QR codes or the links to the reports, but these are also here for you at any time you'd like to access them. So today I'm going to take a much more narrative approach to how we're talking about the report. I welcome you to get in touch with any questions you might have afterwards. But again, this is meant to be informative, but really open questions, open the conversation for any questions you have about research in philanthropy, and realize that this can be accessed by you at any time. So why a landscape report for PFC now? Well, one of the reasons is it's PFC's 25th year, and it was a really good opportunity to build off the previous research, such as snapshot data and investment surveys, compensation surveys that PFC has been doing for many years. We also wanted to extend beyond the T3010 data and really build on a decade of research in philanthropy that has been done in Canada through organizations like Carleton's Masters of Nonprofit Leadership, as well as PhiLab. In this research, we also wanted to link together academia and practice. You'll see that there's a lot of academic citations in the literature review, and that was on purpose as a way to demonstrate what is happening beyond paywalls that practitioners may not have access to, and to show the breadth of philanthropic research. And when we started out, we really thought this report was going to be geared for the general public, so people well outside of philanthropy or philanthropic foundations, as a way to give them an idea of what these institutions are, but also policymakers. So bring them up to speed on some of the current data and also conversation. And I'll get to this a little bit later, but we have absolutely found that there's more findings here for a broader audience group. So how did we go about this? I'm a qualitative researcher. So this was a qualitative exploratory design, and that was really helpful in fields that are quite under-researched, which is the case for Canadian philanthropy. I aggregated several of PFC's previous research, so the snapshot data, investment survey data specifically. I also, as I was mentioning about my positionality in the beginning, took an ethnographic approach. So because I was a postdoctoral researcher with PFC, in some cases I sat a little bit external to the organization so that I could observe the organization, look at the history, be part of affinity groups, just in observation and investment roundtable. But I was also a little bit internal to the organization as well. And again, with my previous experience in philanthropy in Canada. I conducted 21 semi-structured interviews with CEOs across Canada. They were both PFC members and non-members, public and private foundations, and they were geographically dispersed across the country. And in terms of the limitations of this research, everything is self-reported. So even in the PFC surveys of the investment surveys, that is all self-reported data. Obviously, the interviews would be self-reported data. But just to put that in context, the T3010, even though it's an aggregate, that is still self-reported data. So when we are looking at philanthropic data in Canada, it tends to be self-reported. The research was really guided by two questions. The first being, what do we know about the historical development of Canadian foundations and their present-day manifestations? And this really, you'll notice that the lit review and the empirical findings speak to this question. And the second question is more conceptual. How do Canadian philanthropic foundations use their purposes, approaches, and roles to support Canadian civil society? And this is the more academic conceptualization that helps us make sense of the empirical findings. So let's just kick off. So we start with chapter 1, and we have a snapshot slide here that will look quite familiar if you've looked at PFC's previous snapshot data. So this is drawing on the 2021 T3010 data, which shows that we have around 11,000 foundations in Canada who are making annual grants almost of $10 billion and who have $135 billion in assets. Again, we have most of the private and public foundations are found in Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta. And while this snapshot data is really important because it gives us it tracks us over time, the research used this position to ask the question, how do we talk about how we got here? And that really looks at the fact that in many cases of how we tell the story of Canadian philanthropy is through a historical lens. And that might mean something like we talk about the history of English settlers or of French, or we talk about the history of Indigenous giving or Jewish giving or subgroups. And that's really helpful to tell us about those lineages, but it gives us a little bit less of a more holistic view of the question of how can we talk about Canadian philanthropy. And this report offers a slightly different framing. We looked at it through a micro, meso, and macro framing as a way to provide some more holistic views. So for example, the micro level would be looking at individual generosity in Canada. All right, what does that look like? What are the components? Where are shared similarities between different groups? On the meso level, the research talked about subgroups and the important role of subgroups in building society and the important role of subgroups in philanthropy. And when we look at a Canadian society that is full of different subgroups, we can start to identify which subgroup stories we may have heard more of and which we may have not. And as we move then to the macro level group, that gives us some insight to ask questions about how the philanthropic space and field in Canada was built. So whose narrative was dominant, which subgroup influenced how the field was built, why did we make those decisions, why do we operate like we do? And it also creates some space to ask which subgroups have been left out and which subgroups do we not even acknowledge yet. And so this framing of how do we talk about how we got here is slightly different than the more traditional historical view. So let's just kick off here with the empirical findings. So what we did is we asked participants about 3 different categories: regulation, assets, and investments. It's also the way we organize the literature review. And what I want to say is that this graphic of an iceberg is here for a reason. One is we know that the findings in any of these categories can go much deeper. And that is the open opportunity to participate in research, that there is more we need to know. Secondly, when we look at the tips of the iceberg between regulation, assets, and grant making, we know that those stories can get knit up in different ways, depending upon the findings you're using and the perspectives you're taking. So the research really wants to acknowledge that this is the tip of the iceberg. In regulations, from the best evidence we have, we see a large growth of philanthropic foundations in Canada from this idea of having a number of double digits in the 1940s, large post-war growth, and then as you can see, since 2005, the number of foundations growing by 25%. The other piece of the regulation is that the lineage of the regulation has focused on the traditional endowment. And so that's very crucial to acknowledge in terms of new philanthropic vehicles being born, such as flow-through funds or donor-advised funds. That means the regulation has looked at public and private endowments differently. They've been subjected to different disbursement quotas over time, and now we're at a point where they are similar, but it's important to note that the regulatory lineage has focused on the endowment. In the research, we were very interested in how participants viewed recent public policy changes. We asked participants about their perceptions of and any behavior changes due to the recent disbursement quota increase to 5%. And for most participants in the interviews, they said that it actually wasn't modifying their behavior in any significant way. In future research, I would like to monitor that and ask a little bit more specifically about some of those behaviors, because for those who did dissent, who felt that the 5% was going to influence their behaviors, they were concerned that they would be dipping into their endowment in order to satisfy their disbursement quota, as well as their operating costs and so on. And I think this is really important to keep an eye on. And the next slide will talk a little bit more about why. The second policy change was non-qualified donees. And in the participant pool, 13 out of 21 interviewees had reported already making grants to non-qualified donees through a selection of tools. And so as one foundation, or as one participant framed for us, there's the symbology of the policy change, which was really important in terms of making sure that funding was flowing to grassroots communities and marginalized communities and organizations who had not typically received foundation grants. But the functionality, and I should say at the time I interviewed, it was the CRA draft guidelines had been issued, not the final guidelines. So participants reflected on the functionality of the draft guidelines as not being exactly what they thought or trusted, or up to what they were anticipating. So especially for foundations who had been making non-qualified donee grants, they often had a greater due diligence and systems and processes in place for monitoring those, and didn't quite feel like the draft guidelines provided them enough certainty to sort of move out of the systems they had already created. But again, this is an area that we do need to keep an eye on and monitor for how it's being used and where the money is going. The last thing I'll say on regulation is related to the regulation lineage, and that is that for those foundations who had donor advised funds, when I spoke to those participants, there were two different versions. One, who would set the expectations for their individual fund holders that they should be giving at 5% if they're going to be contributing to this foundation's donor advised fund. Another model was that the foundation would help set behavior, help nudge behavior, so that donors could get to 5% disbursement. And so what I want to say here, and what the research says, is this is a slight deviation from that regulatory lineage of traditional foundations, where this is quite industry regulated. And again, another area to keep not so much monitoring, but just for inquiry, how is that working, especially in alignment with the changes in public policy. So the next finding I'd like to talk about is the assets and investments of philanthropic foundations. One of the areas that we were able to see through the research from PFC's previous investment surveys is that there have been historical but also contemporary priorities from the interviews about meeting annual disbursement requirements and preserving real capital. And those are very important to keep in mind Yes, there's absolute evidence of those priorities changing, such that foundations, some are investing for social justice or using environmental goals or different time horizons, changing the use of their endowments. But coming back to the idea of what has been historical and traditional priorities is important to keep in mind. And that's because over the past 13 years, there's been $100 billion in growth in endowments, from 35 billion in 2008 to 135 billion in 2021. Now, most of that time has been in a low interest rate environment, which has seen foundations move from investment strategies of things like fixed income to more global equities and alternative investments, which might be more aggressive, and that might explain a little bit more of the aggregate growth. But when we look at the average foundation, sort of average self-reported returns, we are still seeing 7 to 8%. And that makes some sense if we're looking at a 3.5% disbursement quota plus 2% for inflation, plus a half or 1% for fund management, plus 1% for operations. Now, as I mentioned before, in a 5% disbursement quota environment, we do need to keep an eye on that and see what returns foundations are expecting or are targeting in order to meet that equation. The other piece that I'd like to mention is that while there's been a lot of discourse about socially responsible and impact investing over the past 10, 15 years, the implementation for philanthropic foundations has still been slower. So certainly we've seen that foundations have increased their socially responsible investment strategies. One statistic had shown in 2003, 1 out of 35 foundations who self-reported had socially responsible investments, and moving that into 2021, 25 out of 66 had socially responsible investment strategies. That is growth. In impact investing, with the evidence of the PFC surveys, those numbers still remained in the teens kind of throughout the past 10 years. But again, foundations remain interested in learning and also implemented. And one thing we might need to keep in mind is that in terms of the level of staffing some of these changes require, and the actual number of staff that work currently in philanthropic foundations may not be, maybe a little more incongruent, and I'll mention that in the next slide. The last thing in terms of assets and investments is that the fund managers, the role of the fund managers and the relationship with foundations remains underexplored. And the reason I mention that is because fund managers are advising their other clients, their corporate clients, on sort of the same strategies. So a movement towards equities and alternative investments over this time period. And if foundations are looking to do more socially responsible investing, the question is that incumbent upon the fund managers to provide or upon the foundations to ask for? And so I think we need to explore this role of the fund manager for philanthropic foundations a little bit more. And the final finding is around grant making. And for me, this is the most frustrating one because it is surprisingly difficult and time intensive to use the T3010 grant making data once you've cleaned it and categorized it and aggregated it to actually tell us where money is flowing. And so what we see and what the research presents is a bar chart that demonstrates that most foundations are giving to education, health, social services, and international development. It is more difficult to see the nuances of that giving. What we can show from the research is that from 2018 to 2021, there has been quite a bit of an increase in grant making activity, so in giving. Increasing 23% for public foundations and 72% for private foundations. Now, we might look at that time horizon and say that might include COVID, which might be part of the story, but certainly the years preceding that are showing a track record of increased growth as well. So just coming back to the idea of staff, we were really interested in using the compensation data from the T3010 to see if we could understand the staffing in philanthropic foundations. And using the 2020 data, we found that 26% of public foundations had filled out that component of the T3010, and 9% of private foundations reported having full or part-time staff. So that is quite a small subset of the larger whole of foundations, which gives us some emerging evidence of what barriers or limitations that might be in terms of enacting certain operations or practices, or, as I said before, investment strategies or impact investment strategies. When I spoke to interview participants, I asked them about the emerging areas of their operations or things that they would like us to know about their operations right now. And those I thematically analyzed into 3 areas: generosity, diversity, and risk. And you can read a bit more about those in the research itself. But one of the things I wanted to mention here was this idea of CEOs being in a role that is holding the middle. So holding the middle between, maybe in a family foundation, between the previous generation and the next generation. Holding the middle between board of directors generally and foundation staff. Holding the middle between emerging societal needs and beneficiaries, or relationships with organizations. So for CEOs being in this role, holding the middle, it's really important to acknowledge this in terms of what this role is meant to do in a foundation. All right, so a slight shift in what we've been talking about. We're going to move from the findings to the more conceptual piece, which is the framework that helps tell us what these findings mean. And so this framework is called the Foundation Triangle. It was developed by Helmut Anheier in 2018. And what its use is that it describes the purpose, approach, and roles of a philanthropic foundation and how that foundation is used as a tool in supporting civil society. So what you see around the outside are 3 purposes describing what foundations want to do. So relief, protection, and change. In the top half, you see approach. And in Anheier's version, he talks about approaches being how the foundation is achieving its purposes. So operating charitable programs, grant making, or a mixed approach. And finally, on the bottom, the role is describing foundation's activity types. So is a foundation working towards innovation? Is it complementing the government, substituting the government, or building out programs and services? What this framework helps us to do is it says that any choice a foundation makes necessarily results in trade-offs. And that's one reason that every foundation looks a little bit different from one another, because everybody's making a different choice, resulting in trade-offs. For this research, we wanted to aggregate the findings and see if we could use the Foundation Triangle to talk more about the changes in the Canadian field. So what can we know about Canadian foundations more generally? And what we find, you'll see that there are changes to the triangle, such as the dotted lines between the endpoints. What we realized was that it wasn't just the endpoints that we were seeing in the findings, it was the relationships between endpoints. And so we have relief protection, protection change, and change relief. And in a historical sort of traditional environment, we see Canadian foundations operating in a relief protection situation or environment, such that they would be providing grants to social service organizations or communities. There would be this element of benevolence, which was sitting in relationship with protection. So protection as preservation of culture and arts or music, education, hospitals, preservation also of family legacy, family wealth. More contemporarily, we are seeing a more change-based environment. So change-based being evidenced by public policy changes, practice changes such as trust-based philanthropy, participatory grant making, social impact investing, but that's still sitting in relationship with protection. Again, protection is preservation of ways of operating in a foundation, preservation of wealth, but possibly even protectionism. this idea that foundations do have choices, individual choices to make in how they operate, and they may be protecting some of those things. And then between change and relief, that's a more emergent space. Interview participants talked about this in two ways. The first was, in a change-based environment, they were wondering and questioning, how can I continue to support relief in the way that I have been, such as maybe gifts to social service organizations, or community in the way that I have been, whereas I'm also being asked to support more grassroots or local level organizations. So they were questioning, how do I use the funds available to balance that? So I realize I'm being asked to participate in the change-based environment in certain ways, but I also have these traditional models of how I give. How do I reconcile the two? The second way was just the sheer scope of what relief looks like is changing. So we have the global pandemic, cost of living crisis, Canadian wildfires. These are things that are very, very big relief demands, but they are different perhaps than what foundations have had to experience before. And so there's some change that foundations are going through to try to understand how to satisfy the new relief. If we look at the top half of the triangle again, you'll see that we've added a few more components that foundations can use to talk about their approach. The first one being investments. We think this is really important because, as we talked about, foundations are taking that is part of their approach in how they are using their foundation as a tool. So that can be traditional investment, that's fine, or it could be socially responsible or impact investing. But having a framework and language, including that in a foundation approach, is really important. The second piece is philanthropic vehicle, and this is also a nod toward foundations who are using donor-advised funds to advance their mission, flow through funds, again, acknowledging that there are things outside of the traditional endowment that foundations are using. I will say we did not include advocacy in this triangle at this point, as it did not come up from participants in a large way, but we do realize that in operating charitable programs, advocacy is a component of that and should be talked about as part of foundations approaches. And then finally on the bottom, we did a little resituation of those four terms into a matrix, because what we saw was that historically foundations were sitting in the lower quadrant between building out programs and services, and complementing government. So building out things that maybe government was already supporting, but the foundations would come on to make it more robust. So in this social welfare state, adding things to the core offerings. What we also started seeing now is that some foundations are looking more at the innovation space. So things like gender lens investing, social impact bonds, foundations looking at ways of doing things in a new way, not just building out or scaling out. The area that's emerging from the research, again, in relation to some of the global pandemic, cost of living crisis events, is this idea of substitution of government. There was some evidence emerging from the interviews showing that foundations were funding food banks or felt they were doing something more reactive than they would have been due to gaps they felt were left by government pulling back funding or things that government couldn't have predicted. And so there becomes a question then of, are there places where philanthropic foundations feel like they are substituting for government as part of their role in civil society? The quadrant that I didn't have anything in the research is innovation and substitution. Now, in subsequent conversations and through these presentations, people have reflected that their views on whether there are elements in innovation and substitution and whether there should be. So that is an emerging area of research. And what I'd like to just, say for this philanthropic, the foundation triangle, is that, again, this is a tool. This is a shared language, a shared framework that we can use to understand the foundation as a tool and how it supports civil society. At the beginning, I talked about the audience that we thought we would be writing this report for as being the general public and policymakers. But as we got into the research, we realized that the findings coming out would be really applicable for practitioners such as foundation staff, foundation professionals, foundation leadership, board of directors, as well as independent and academic researchers who might be looking at foundations for the first time or thinking about what methodological tools they could use in order to understand these foundations. So we think there's something here for everybody. We will be having our 25th national conference in September in Ottawa. And I just really want to welcome you into this research conversation. There will be a research panel at the conference. We will be discussing the landscape report. I welcome you to read the landscape report in advance of the conference, but also know that this is an emerging research conversation for PFC that we are welcoming you into as we move forward. So if you have questions from this presentation, please do get in touch. I'm very happy to speak with you and answer them and nuance anything that might not be clear. Thank you very much for listening along. As I said, please reach out with any questions, and I look forward to hearing from you.